Hello, everyone, and welcome to World Channel Meet the Makers live event. I'm Evelyn Brito, event producer for World Channel. If this is your first time watching this on Facebook, on YouTube, please give us a like and share. Our Meet the Makers event brings together diverse filmmakers and thought leaders from around the world to discuss how stories and documentaries relate to our daily lives. On today's panel, we welcome award-winning filmmaker Sarita Khurana from our Asian American Resilience and Beyond film series, a World Channel partnership with ADOC Network and CAM. But before I introduce the speaker, let's watch the Crossroads trailer.
Intentional unit, there is only one shooter, gunshot wound to the head. He is down.
Family stories are not what you read in history books or see on television. They've deeply affected why I want to be a filmmaker. Those narratives, those ancestors' voices, our families' voices are critical to preserving who we are, and those stories need to be told.
Our moderator today is Rav Singh, an award-winning film and TV director and art activist. Welcome, Rav.
Hi, thank you very much, Evelyn. Thanks for having me, and welcome everybody. My name is Rabjot Mahek Singh. I'm a Sikh filmmaker and art activist. I'm glad to be part of this discussion on World Channel about the Crossroads documentary. I often say that Sikhs are a minority of a minority. We're a religious minority even in our home country of India, and out here in the United States, we are certainly an even smaller minority. And this is why discussions like these are so important, because we need more Sikh representatives to speak up and share our experiences and be heard in a world where our voices are drowned out no matter where we are in the diaspora. Media and representation carries so much weight when it comes to modern day politics and issues. We live in an era where social media and art has created lasting movements which ignite change. And as a Sikh filmmaker, that's my goal, to bring that attention to our small but strong population and educate others about who we are as Sikhs, especially in the US, where sentiments against Sikhs, Muslims, and other brown people became fueled with hate and misinformation after 9/11. That's why Crossroads is an incredibly important film for so many reasons, especially how it highlights the Sikh community of Indianapolis. And during this conversation, we'll hear from the filmmaker about the making of our film, as well as Sikh thought leaders about how this story had a tremendous impact on the Sikh community. So thank you, everybody. Thanks for joining. And this is meant to be an open, fluid discussion. So please feel free to add your own experiences and thoughts to absolutely any question. Everyone's welcome to answer any question. And I'll begin by asking you each to introduce yourselves and ask you some questions. So let's start with the filmmaker. Hi, Sarita, how are you? Please introduce yourself.
Sorry about that. Hi, everyone. Hi, I'm Sarita Khurana. I'm the director of the film. Thanks so much for having me today and putting the panel together. A lot of thanks to World Channel.
Thank you, Sarita. I can't wait to hear your experiences on this film. Thank you for joining Amrit. I can't wait to hear experiences with the Sikh Coalition. Please feel free to introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. I'm Amrit Kaur Akri. I'm the legal director for the Sikh Coalition. The Sikh Coalition is the nation's largest Sikh civil rights organization. And as a legal director, we represent Sikhs who have been discriminated against based on their religious identity. So a lot of employment discrimination, hate crimes, racial profiling, religious rights violations, school bullying, and the like. I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And next I have the pleasure of introducing an old colleague of mine, Ashmita. Would you care to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Rabjot. It's always great to work with you in any capacity. I am the director of programming and network distribution at Just Broadcasting. We are home to 4 full-time South Asian TV networks, broadcast nationwide as well as internationally, but we're also home to Just Punjabi, which is the first Punjabi American full-time TV network on air for the last 15 years. in the United States, as well as internationally and even back home in India. And our explicit purpose is, like Sarita put it so eloquently, is to tell those minority stories, the stories of the minorities of the minority, and give the diaspora a voice no matter where they live outside of their home in Punjab. Thank you so much for having me. I look forward to being part of this conversation.
Of course, next up is Navpreet, who I have been following on TikTok for such a long time and has such an amazing impact on so many countless youth. Nav, would you care to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi. Thank you for having me. My name is Navpreet Singh. I'm also known as Nav the Poet on social media. I'm a spoken word artist and content creator that talks and advocates for the Sikh community.
Wonderful. And last but not least, Maninder, please introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you for having me on this panel. I'm having a difficulty with my little bit laptop as well as the desktop. Finally, I came to my cell phone, so I apologize for that. I am Maninder Singh Walia. I've been living here in Indianapolis for 33 years, and I serve as a chair for the Board of Trustees, Sikh Worship Center in Indianapolis. Thanks for having me here.
Awesome to have you all. So many incredible thought leaders for the South Asian Sikh community on one panel. It's going to be wonderful. So I'm going to start off with the filmmaker herself. So I just wanted to kind of get a scope for, especially for folks who don't know or haven't watched the film yet. Sarita, would you mind telling us what is Crossroads?
Sure. So Crossroads is a short documentary about the FedEx mass shooting that took place last April 21 in Indianapolis at one of the largest FedEx warehouses in the country. There were 8 victims in the shooting, 4 of whom were Sikhs. And, you know, so the film is about not just the shooting, but what the Sikh community experienced after the shooting, how they dealt with it, the legal investigation by the FBI and the police, and how the community responded, how they healed. And one of the remarkable things when I first heard about this shooting was that the FedEx warehouse has about 80 or 90% of its workers are Sikhs and Punjabis. And that was astonishing to me. And right away, when I first saw this in the news, in the media, it struck me immediately, like that such a large number of workers at this FedEx facility were Sikhs. You know, was this intentional? Was it a hate crime? You have to realize that last year when this took place was also the 20th year anniversary of 9/11. So that was a lot on my mind. And as we all know, you know, since 9/11, Sikhs have really been targeted for mistaken identity, in an anti-Muslim backlash. And it really made me wonder what was going on in this community at this FedEx warehouse. And so my interest in the film really came as sort of an investigation into what was happening and why it was happening. So that's what the film is really about.
Right. I've actually heard that the first person who was killed, unfortunately, in a hate crime after 9/11 was actually a Sikh, Balbir Singh Sodhi. So how did this journey begin? Like, what interested you specifically into looking into the Sikh community? Like, what is your tie with the Sikh community?
I'm also Punjabi, like many Sikhs are, and culturally, you know, I grew up going to a Sikh temple in Queens, where I grew up in New York. And so there was a lot of cultural familiarity in terms of the language, the people, the food. And so while I'm not from Indianapolis and actually didn't know anyone in Indianapolis, I felt an affinity for the community and what was happening. And certainly, you know, being South Asian myself and living in the US, you know, since 9/11, I'm a New Yorker. I was around when 9/11 happened, and seeing the backlash against, Muslims, South Asians, and Arabs. It's something that you live with day to day, and is very much part of my experience and the experience of many people I know in New York and throughout the US. And so, like I said, though I was not from Indianapolis, I felt an affinity. And I reached out I reached out to a friend who put me in touch with the Sikh Coalition, actually, because I heard right away they had started doing some work on the ground in Indianapolis, responding to this tragedy. And so it was a way for me to try to connect. And within a couple of weeks of the shooting actually happening, I went out to Indianapolis and I met quite a few people. The Sikh Coalition was there on the ground. Nothing was funded at this point, but I felt compelled to go out there and try to understand what was happening. So that was at the end of April, a couple of weeks after the shooting happened. And it was very difficult at that time because people were still very much grieving and in crisis mode. And while I met a few people at the local gurdwaras, I think initially it was still hard to sort of really connect and try to tell this story or speak to the victims, the survivors or family members, because people were very much still in crisis mode. And so it wasn't till many months later that I was really able to go out and meet people like Maninder Valia, who was one of the Gurdwara community leaders, connect with Amrit at the Sikh Coalition. And really, that sort of impetus was when ADOC, the Asian American Documentary Network, World Channel, and CAM was sort of putting this series together on Asian American resilience. And I pitched this idea and ultimately it was commissioned. So it was really through all these efforts that we were able to go back in November of this past year and film with the community, meet some of those survivors, meet some of the family members like Gary Johal, whose mother is featured in the video and was one of the victims, and be able to start to tell this story. When I went in, there weren't a lot of I was also discovering what was happening. We didn't know how people felt about the police investigation and the FBI investigations initially. We didn't know how people felt about FedEx and the security issues. I think a lot of those things we discovered as we were on the ground and they were told to us. So we didn't have a lot of assumptions about this was definitely a hate crime or this wasn't a hate crime. I think we had a lot of questions, and our point was really to learn from those in the community what was happening and what they were concerned with and how they felt about what was happening. And that's the story we tried to tell.
Right, and I think that was conveyed beautifully in the film as well. And there is, talk actually of a red flag law. Amrit, I wanted to ask you, what is the red flag law? Can you kind of give a summary of it for folks who don't know and how that relates to this case?
Yeah, so red flag laws in general are laws, or state level laws that allow law enforcement agencies to essentially flag somebody who is potentially a harm or a threat to themselves or to others based on violent, conduct or significant mental health issues that might result in violence or harm to themselves or others. And those are people who, based on legitimate evidence, including having possession of weapons and having access to instigating such harm, are brought before the prosecutor's office, who then brings them before the court and a judge who makes a determination on whether these people should be allowed access or prohibited access from having firearms and those types of weapons. So in Indiana, at the time, in April of 2021, there was a red flag law on the books that would have, in this case, required the police to confiscate all the weapons in the shooter's house and submit his paperwork within 24 hours to the district attorney's office, who then had up to 3 days to petition before a judge on whether the shooter in this case should have had access to weapons, based on an incident that occurred almost exactly a year before the shooting in this case.
So I'm hearing it could have been preventable, but not enough was done essentially.
In this case, yeah, the red flag, there were balls dropped essentially all across the board. And it's hard to pinpoint exactly who did what and where things went wrong, because there was so much finger pointing by the law enforcement agencies involved in this area. There was just, kind of just a real lack of transparency in who was doing what and who was supposed to do what and who had what information in a timely manner. What we do know is that in March of 2020, when there was an opportunity for the shooter to go before a judge, and a judge would determine if they, should not have access to weapons, that never happened. And so the result of that was, over the course of the next several months, he was able to purchase several guns, 2 of which were used in the shooting at the FedEx facility.
Why do you think they were so slow to react? And how do you think it could have been handled, better?
The Sikh Coalition doesn't focus on these types of criminal laws, so I can't speak to the specifics of Indiana's red flag law or what happened here. I am a former prosecutor. I was a prosecutor in Chicago for over 11 years. So in my previous life, I do have a lot of experience with these types of laws. But what I can put together here is that there was just such a lack of transparency that no one was held accountable. And it really hasn't been explained to the community or to the lawyers that were involved that are, to this day representing several of the families of victims and survivors as to where the breakdown was and why that didn't happen. We submitted requests to the police department and to the DA's office to kind of get a better understanding of why that didn't happen. But to this day, I still don't know. And, that is a question as a representative of many of the families that really burns at me. I wish I knew why, but I don't know that we're ever going to fully understand why that didn't happen. I think it was something procedural that the prosecutor's office felt like they had a discretion over, and they just used their discretion not to bring that petition forward.
Right. And, it just kind of speaks to this larger issue, that it's kind of a scary time, especially for a lot of minorities, especially for, us as Sikhs, in an era where violence and hatred is on the rise. I just want to kind of get, your own personal perspectives of how this has affected you. Maninder, you are part of the Sikh Sangat there. How has it affected you? And, what kind of challenges have come after this incident?
I think Amrit mentioned earlier, you asked her the question about the red flag law. My mind goes in a circle that the states, they don't have a red flag law. How will they protect their citizens? Having a red flag law here in Indianapolis, it didn't work. Prosecutor's office failed. He was never presented to the judge. Things would have been different. So as Amrit rightly said, that there were many balls were dropped everywhere. So there were finger pointing going on and all that stuff. Especially, now I come to your question, for the minority communities. We are not trained for this kind of violence. We have no clue, and certainly we don't have any budget or anything that we send our volunteers to get trained for mass shooting or anything. We are, as Ashmita said earlier, we are the minor of the minority community. We don't have any luxury like this, that we are civically, and especially with our community, civically, we are not engaged. We are far behind. This is the truth. There's nothing to be hide. But here's the deal that after 9/11, it just didn't happen now. This has been going on after 9/11. People saw turban beards as something to be fearful of, and they start attributing it as we are all terrorists. You know, this is not now. After 22 years, 22 years later, we are still struggling. You know, and yes, 4 days after 9/11, Balbir Singh Sodhi, as you mentioned earlier, he was shot at his gas station. What did he do wrong? Nothing. And then look at the Oak Creek, Wisconsin. Mass shooting at the worship center Gurdwara. So all these things, you know, we don't have any answers for these. Gun violence is one side, but targeting minorities, that's a huge different issue. You know, and now I'm hearing both houses in DC, they're passing for gun laws and this and that. It's about time. How many more lives they want to see there? They're gone. And I hate to point this thing. The minority leader from, what's his name, from Kentucky. I don't remember his name, but he's saying, well, I can vote for the better gun laws. It's about time. You know, this is not just right. And personally, after this attack, community is still feeling like, are we the target? You know, he visited, according to the FBI report I mentioned in the movie, he visited many other sites. Brendan Cole. Why did he choose FedEx? Because he was a former employee. You know, he was turned in by his mother a year ago, and he was never charged, nothing, and he was able to buy more guns. So there are so many questions, and we will never know the motive behind it, because clearly we don't know how to prove that this is a hate crime or not. But we're still worried, yes, because of our looks. Anything happens in Afghanistan or anywhere in the Middle East, we are in bullseye. You know, after doing so much work at the mainstream level, we're still a target. You know, I'm not saying everybody's bad, but there a lot of help has been provided after the shooting by the IMPD, local here, FBI, all that stuff. But what good is it now? The tragedy would have been avoided. There was no reason for senseless shooting there.
Absolutely. I think Nav, you have incredible insight into, you know, also being a Sikh man who's living in post 9/11 America. I mean, I just want to hear your experiences and, you know, how the, I guess, gaze or bias has shifted after that incident. We've talked about it a little bit before in our previous talks too, but I think that would be incredibly valuable perspective and story.
Yeah, sure. So for context, I was 9 years old when 9/11 happened. So I grew up in a post 9/11 world. I went to school with classmates who then started looking at me differently, calling me different names. And these are kids, 10 years old, 12-year-olds, that are being fed this hate, this ignorance, and this bias, and then expressing it towards other children. And I think that's always been my biggest concern, is that we as in like society has allowed that ignorance to permeate all the way to children, who then grow up with this bias inside of them their entire lives, to the point where then I get, as I'm older, and you know, I used to wear a patka, which is a smaller turban, but once I had this proper turban, elderly people just like staring at me, glaring at me everywhere I go. Getting one of the weirdest incidents I've ever had is I'm walking down the street and someone decides to shout, "Go back to your effing country" to me while driving past me. I don't even know what purpose that serves on their part. Like, does it make them feel better? It's such a weird situation to exist in where I can't be like, not I can't be myself. I am myself. And I think that's the biggest thing for me is I found comfort in my identity, but I can't exist in the world without the concern of what someone's going to say or do. Even, we've already mentioned Balbir Singh Sodhi, and there's been dozens, if not hundreds of hate crimes since 9/11 on Sikhs. And so as someone who grew up in New York as well, anytime I go to the city, I don't always know what's going to happen and what I should be prepared for, because I choose to still maintain and represent my identity, my faith. And it's just so not unbelievable, but it's just so hard to fathom sometimes how we as society has allowed this anger and hatred to just exist, just freely exist. And there's a lack of effort made to combat it from the greater society. Obviously, minority communities do what they can, but we are minorities, so we don't have that power, we don't have that status to really effectively, on the large scale, make that impact to change the perceptions.
One thing I heard that kind of stood out to me was, you feel comfortable in your identity now, which is amazing. And we've talked about this before, but it's still so difficult to maintain it. And a lot of folks, a lot of our own, Sikh men in particular, I feel they often shed that identity. They often shed, the dadi, which is a beard, and the pag, which is a turban, to kind of assimilate, to kind of fit in, to avoid being targets of hate crimes. So it's just, I can definitely speak to that as well. I've grown up being called Osama's daughter as the primary nickname at school. So, I trust that we've all heard it all on this panel. Ashmita, I mean, you work for an amazing channel that kind of helps bring that representation forward, and y'all are in New York City, and I know you travel around the United States. I know you guys do an amazing job kind of, being out there on the field and bringing that representation forward. How do you think that representation, being more inclusive in mainstream media especially, could help the Western perspective on Sikhs?
Once again, thank you for, including the representation aspect in this conversation. I think when we talk about hate, it's really easy to look at the individual who is the culprit behind any action, whether it's a mass shooter, whether it's a town that has certain tendencies and they're passing laws, a state, but really it's a cultural thing, right? And the media and works of art, production, content, the kind of work that Sarita does as a filmmaker, you do, Rabjot, through various art installations, as well as your films, and the work that we do as traditional media, they kind of drive the narrative of how folks think about people. And, there are certain parallels, and I'll hit them really quickly. In the media, representation of African Americans in the United States, I'll just use that as an example, for the longest time, always took the narrative of a very negative connotation, right? It had to do with crime and drugs and dressing a certain way and being associated with certain behaviors. But it took for African Americans to get to places of power, whether that was on mainstream news stations, in houses of power like government, like the highest office of power, in business, entrepreneurship, and sports, excel in every field, for that narrative to slowly shift. And so now when you see African Americans being represented in a movie, in any work of fiction or nonfiction, the narrative is very different. It's not all negative, but it's more true to life, right? And that is something that I think Sikhs have struggled with because of our historical connection to India. And that struggle continues even as we come to these new homes where, whether it's America, UK, Canada, we kind of carry that chip on our shoulder, or our parents do, right? But I think with the right amount of hard work, strategic placement of folks that look like us, that speak like us, that speak to our story and our struggle, can make a big difference. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not right away, but over the long term. And one can only hope with that difference in place, that societal shift in looking at us as different, as outsiders, as terrorists. People will look at us as the hardworking members of society that we are, that we believe in Seva, right, which is a selfless act of charity, that our houses of worship have free food at all times, are open to everyone, and that we believe in protecting others and serbat tawala, the good of all, right? So these are tenets of our belief system that will only, make their way out to the larger audience, larger society, if folks like you and Sarita and Manindaji, Nav, Amrit, that Sikh Coalition, organizations like that keep doing what they're doing. But the representation in media and in works of content, I think is a pillar of the long-term effort that we have to do here as a community.
Absolutely. And I've actually heard you talk about this before, Ash, but I think, the same question applies to Sarita and Nav as well. I think one of the issues that Punjabi media has with itself is kind of, catering to itself. And I think a lot of ethnic media does this, where they end up just kind of, they definitely do spread their messages, but it ends up not hitting the right audience. The audience that we want to be hitting is, the Western audiences that wouldn't otherwise turn on channels like ours. So, I'm wondering what your take is on how to really, infiltrate and get our word out there to the right audience, to the right Western audience, instead of just, circling it around in our own communities.
Well, I mean, I know this is not the nicest thing to say, but the first thing is we have to get out of our own way, right? And it's like you said, sometimes we think that, if other Punjabis, other Sikhs, other Indians are watching us and listening to us, then the work is done and we, don't have to bother about anybody else. And that, I think, is the first mistake. But, I think there's a whole generation of us that don't feel that way and certainly don't conduct ourselves in our professional capacity in that way. But once we, start getting that time, that attention span of folks outside of our community, I think it's really important to not just talk about the things that matter to us as a community, kind of our wants and needs, but to talk about things where it's about, the country or the system that we live in at large, right? So, for example, Asian Americans, not just Sikhs, Punjabis, or Indians, but Asian Americans, the API group is such a influential group in the United States. But I feel that, this is just a personal, kind of a grudge of mine. I feel that Punjabis don't really engage with API as much as they could. Now, certain organizations definitely do. Sikh Coalition is one of those, and there is a handful of others. But we're not doing it on the level we do because we're so focused on just talking about ourselves, right? When we go to DC, when we go to our state legislatures, the conversation needs to be about whether it's hate crime or immigration policy or small business resources. It needs to be bigger than just us Punjabis or us Sikhs or us Indians, right? It needs to be that, okay, like New York, my home, here in Queens, there's a huge community of Bangladeshis, Pakistanis, Nepalis, Punjabis, Gujaratis, Hindus, all manner. And they are not always coming together as a voting bloc, but recently they have been, and you can see the difference leading into these midterms. I think that's a success story, right? If we could replicate that effort across the board, this is local level, but if we could replicate that at the state or the federal level, that would make such a big difference. And so, I think the first step is we just got to get out of our own way, in a couple of different manners. Once we do, I think we'll see that we have a huge contingent of folks just like us that we could partner with to bring about meaningful change.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that sentiment 100%. And I think someone who does that perfectly, especially online, Navpreet, I'd love for you to talk about how you, create media and content that's educational, but also, I guess the word is non-confrontational, such that a lot of Western audiences, so a lot of non-Sikhs, a lot of non-Punjabis, and even non-South Asians come and specifically look at your TikTok content or some of the stuff that you post online on YouTube. So I'd love to get your take on how you've been crafting your material to kind of go further than just the Punjabi community.
Sure. Interestingly enough, a lot of it stems from a lack of support from my own community. So I stopped catering to them. It's kind of sad to say, but I just didn't focus on that. And also because I've always lived with this identity and I just always get questions, and I was understanding specifically how TikTok with social media algorithms work, and people are seeing this face on their screens and probably are uncomfortable asking questions. So I just was someone willing to open that conversation up and started talking about Sikhi and letting people know that they could ask questions. And I don't approach them with a sense of judgment or, frustration because they don't know, that I don't wear my turban in the shower. It's a common question I get. But I don't look at it as, wow, how can you not know that or think that? I just go, okay, this is something so unfamiliar to you. Just as I have a lot of, or a lack of knowledge of different faiths and other cultures. And yeah, I just always want people to take a genuine interest, and that comes from being a Sikh. Honestly, is our gurus have taught us to be compassionate and open, and also learners. Sikh means student for those who don't know, and so I'm learning along the way. I'm not a perfect Sikh, I'm not the most knowledgeable Sikh, and so what I've done on my platforms is opened up a space for people to learn alongside me. Is I think that's the biggest thing, is I make it clear that I'm not the most knowledgeable, and I'm learning alongside this audience that's asking me these questions. And even the times I do get rude comments, disrespectful, or even hateful, I always seek out a way to address the comment with some sense of better understanding about the faith. So just a quick example, I make videos where I show myself tying my turban, and someone commented like, oh, this person would take longer than their wife. Like, who would want to be with someone who like takes a long time to get ready, whatever. And I use that as an opportunity to talk about how Sikhi is all about equality of people, and talk about different principles and practices enacted by the Sikh gurus that express that equality. And instead of belittling that commenter, because that's not going to accomplish anything, I focused on those who would be open to learning. And so my approach is always, what can I contribute to really help people better understand myself, my beliefs, and the community as a whole?
I actually think that the documentary itself, Crossroads, does a wonderful job of not just pigeonholing itself into just the Punjabi and Sikh community of Indianapolis. I mean, Sarita, what lens did you film this documentary through? Like, as a filmmaker, how did you assure that your film was going to be seen as it is today, by folks that are not just local, not just in the Sikh community?
Yeah, I think, right now, the big issue that we've come around is gun violence, right? And, mass shootings, that unfortunately, there've been quite a few in the past month. Just as the film was released, we had the shooting in Buffalo, soon after the shooting in Texas at the elementary school. I think this is one way, that people can come together and can empathize with a community like the Sikh community in Indianapolis. Like, these are issues that all Americans are facing, right? The issues of gun violence, the issues of mass shootings, and it affects all communities. One of the things that was striking for me was I didn't even know there was a rapidly growing Sikh population in the Midwest, in Indianapolis. You know, when you think of South Asian communities, you often think of them on the East Coast or the West Coast, where we don't even think about Asian Americans, quite frankly, in the Midwest. You know, even the Asian American population in general is invisible. And so, you know, whether it's through, you know, these common issues that we care about, you know, telling these kinds of stories, for me, you know, shedding light on a community you may not know about, making those stories visible is the lens I take, you know. And it's, you know, like I said in the beginning, it's not from the perspective of I'm going in there and I know the story I want to tell, but it's really allowing, you know, and working with, you know, the community for those voices to tell that story. Of course, I have a lens of wanting to make, you know, these stories visible and at the center, but that's part of the narrative of, you know, our communities are part of America. We are Americans. You know, Maninder, when we were in Indianapolis, like I could hear his frustration over and over again. Like, what else do we need to do to prove that we're Americans? Like, we're here, we contribute to the society, we, you know, work with the police departments to educate them, we work with the school systems to let them know who we are. So we're not misunderstood, we're not pulled over, and some police officers, why are you carrying that thing that looks like a little knife? You know, like these are part of Sikh religious tenets, and you know, there needs to be some education, but there also needs to be some kind of collaboration and working together with these institutions. But as a storyteller, for me, the work is really around telling the stories, shedding the light on communities. And you know, these stories are, you know, the stories of Texas. These are the stories of Buffalo. We're experiencing the same things as a community. And I think that commonality is where we can build from, you know. And the other thing for me that's really important is shedding a very personal light on, you know, telling the story of someone like Gary Johal, whose mother was a victim of this shooting, you know, building those very personal and intimate connections. You know, when someone's grieving over the loss of their mother, you know, who was in a mass shooting, I mean, I think it's a tragedy, and most people don't experience that. But I think in hearing his personal story, you can begin to connect to him. You can begin to connect to this community. This is not an alien community. You know, we're not just immigrants. We're real people. We have real feelings that are very common to everyone, and that's a place I start.
You know, in the documentary, what's interesting is, you know, it was so recent that I'd be interested to know, and I'm sure a lot of folks are interested to know, what are the new developments that have happened, you know, after the incident. Because when you went in and captured everything, it was still very new. So maybe a question for yourself and Amrit as well. What are the new developments? Has anything, you know, even began to, you know, head towards a resolution?
Yeah, I mean, we were there we did the majority of our filming about 7 months after the incident. And at that time, there were several lawsuits either possibly going to happen that were suing the FBI and even FedEx. You know, and the film doesn't really focus on FedEx as much as it does on the FBI and police investigations, but there were a lot of security issues. People had issues with FedEx for their security and why the shooter was able to get into the building and spend so much time before anyone was alerted. So there were several lawsuits being contemplated by some of the survivors and family members of the victims against both the police department and the FBI. Where those lawsuits have gone, I think maybe Maninder or Amrit could say more about those, but that was definitely one thing that was happening in the community at the time that we were filming. And we weren't able, you know, just to say, because those were happening, we weren't able to speak to everybody that was involved in the shooting just because they couldn't be on camera because they're involved in lawsuits or, because they were just dealing still with the trauma of the shooting. But I think Maninder and Amrit could probably say more about where things are at in terms of that.
Yeah, in terms of some of the legal investigations, when the Sikh Coalition first touched ground in Indianapolis, so the shooting happened on Thursday night. We had staff there by Saturday morning to meet with community members, and I'm in Chicago. We had staff in Ohio, so we brought in staff from other areas. So, luckily we had people that could be there fairly quickly. And I'm familiar. I knew Maninder. He knows my family. So many of us had connections to people on the ground there already. So we could hit the ground running, which was nice. And we immediately, came from a place where we expected law enforcement to take this seriously. And as a community that's dealt with so much bias and discrimination and trauma, obviously, to Nav's point, you can't separate that trauma from the incident that happened. When you know that this facility is primarily Punjabi employed, there are lots of dots that got connected for community members that are so used to having to deal with discrimination on a daily basis. So we were putting those pieces together instantly. And our goal was to try and rally up all the community members that had been impacted and make sure that law enforcement had spoken with them so law enforcement could get the full picture. And our expectation always is and always was that they will do their jobs. And so we, wanted to give them the opportunity to do their jobs. And we were really fortunate. We leaned on a lot of other lawyers across the country from our networks that provided pro bono service. So, there was a lot that was happening outside of just the shooting itself. There were workers' compensation issues for the employees of FedEx that were there that had been physically or emotionally traumatized. There were immigration issues for the families that had lost, people in the shooting that needed relatives from other parts of the world to come and be a part of funerals and last rites and those kinds of things. And then there were just a host of other sort of legal issues that come from somebody dying so unexpectedly. And we, our first goal was to make sure that we were able to provide support for those and that the community was settled in some capacity, simultaneously trying to ensure that the law enforcement agencies had what they needed to have. At some point, pretty quickly, I would say, definitely by the summer of 2021, it started to become clear that law enforcement agencies had made a decision. And Maninder, I think you spoke about this in the film, and I thought that was really powerful, where you said that some of the things they said to you within the first few days were some of the things they were saying to you on the day they closed it out. So it's difficult to, being on the receiving end of news like that, to understand how a determination could be made within the first 48 hours when no investigation had been done, little to no investigation, that's 100% consistent with something months and months later. And so that's when, as attorneys and, as legal teams, we decided that we needed to do our own sort of investigation and really start to understand what was happening. And because we represented individuals on the ground, we had to understand what was in the best interest of those clients and then the community, because as many of us have referenced on this call, hate and bias is a crime that impacts the entire community, that represents, that the person who was targeted represents. So we spent many months continuing to investigate, definitely looking at whether, there were security issues, definitely looking at FedEx, definitely looking at the shooter himself, and just and law enforcement agencies, and trying to get the big picture before we kind of jump the gun on any sort of next step. What was interesting is that very quickly after the shooting, law enforcement said that the investigation's essentially closed, which in the legal realm means, okay, now if we submit a Freedom of Information Act request, you should be giving us all of the documents from this investigation. Well, we did that, and then suddenly they reopened the investigation. And whether they were actually reopening the investigation or they just didn't want to turn over what likely amounted to very little work, I don't know. Eventually, we did get some of those pieces of information, but it was very recently. So I can tell you, we're still looking through some of those documents because it was that recently that we received it. And there are a lot of documents to go through. Not all of it is relevant to the shooting. When we ask for things, we ask for a whole lot of things that we piece through and could be relevant. So, we're looking through that. But then we also have to remember there are 8 different people who lost their lives. And so those are 8 different families that have different approaches to what was done right, what wasn't done right, and what the approach was. I can't speak for any of those families. I'm sure, just being an observer, I would feel like I do not have closure based on where it currently stands in terms of who's legally responsible and what are those next steps. And I think with a shooting like this, there's just so much to take in. And you have survivors who were so violently injured, who are lucky to have their lives still, that you do have to take it really slowly. And luckily that's built into the law. There's a couple of years before you actually need to file a lawsuit. So a lot of, I think part of what Sarita is referring to in terms of, there were some investigations going on, there were some notices put out about potential lawsuits. So that was all legally procedural. Under Indiana state laws, you had to provide notice within a certain period of time that you were at a minimum investigating to potentially file a lawsuit. Doesn't necessarily mean lawsuits were going to be filed. I think at least one lawsuit has been filed at this point. And we're not involved with that litigation, so I don't know the ins and outs of it. But I do know that we've had to claw for transparency from the law enforcement agencies and the records. I always wonder why, especially having been a prosecutor. I was ready to hand over my files if somebody needed access to them. And those kinds of questions are the questions that will probably continue to haunt me as we move through this. But in there, I don't know if you have more from the community perspective.
I think repeat my words again. This was the report when I questioned when they were giving the decision that the findings were declared to the families and everybody else. And I was sitting in the front row. And, again, I will read that line again, which I said in the movie also. It was determined the shooter considered other targets for an attack, but chose FedEx location. Why did he choose FedEx location? Number one. Number two, okay, we understand that IMPD or no police, as Chief Randall said, we were no police officer or anybody wants to hear this. They don't want to get any call like this, that this has happened. No law enforcement will want to know. But they know the population is growing here. They know we have an immigrant welcome center here. We have introduced all that. We have Asian American Alliance here. I'm not talking about Sikhs. Asian American population is going up. Cities welcoming thousands of other folks here. Are we not prepared as a city, as a mayor's office, that population is growing? And then I go to the FedEx facility. They can use 90% of the workers as Sikhs, but they are unable to protect them. Why? That was a big security failure on the behalf of FedEx facility themselves. We've seen many things there. We have questioned, but again, all these things are ignored. As are we less Americans than anybody else? No, we are a peace loving community. We are a proud community. We contribute as Americans. We don't just sit around. We are hard workers. But these folks who are in power, city level, state level, they have to understand this is a wake-up call. They need to get their act together. They exactly need to know what is going on, where this population is coming from. City need more diverse officers. They need more. There were no translator. There are four Sikhs have been shot. There is no translator. I just showed up as a volunteer. When I heard, I said, no, what has happened? So I was playing both sides. You know, on one instance, there was a rumor in the community that, oh, he works with police. So from my community, our community, I was being looked at, oh, why I am favoring both sides? No, this is all these things, they have to be looked at very seriously, in my opinion. And I think our work continues. It's not the end of the work. Amritji, your father, Rajendrabir Singh Mago, I have known him from early 90s. Punjabi Cultural Society has done a very good job in Chicago. And we are following the same model here. You know, we're mingling with other communities. We're doing everything to make this a better place for everybody.
Absolutely. And one thing, oh, sorry about that. Just wanted to start to wrap up, since we've been here for quite some time. And I know we can continue to talk about this subject for hours and hours, because, our Sikh community has been underserved for such a long time, especially after 9/11, as, we all agree. So we could definitely share our stories, and we will continue to, and I hope to continue to hear, resolutions come out of this situation. But, from what it sounds like there's a lot of grieving that's still happening. There's still a lot of unanswered questions, still a lot of question marks everywhere. But I mean, Sarita, you've done an amazing job with the documentary, with Crossroads calling attention to this shooting and to gun violence in general, and kind of helping, connect to a larger audience with that broad messaging. I mean, what is the call to action?
Thank you. I want to thank specifically World Channel and ADOC and CAM for putting this series together and giving me the opportunity to tell this story, because honestly, it was dropped from the national media within days of happening, this shooting in Indianapolis. And I feel like, it would have just gone to, nobody would have heard, nobody would have followed up, nobody would have, really heard about it. It would have stayed in our insular community, right? So I think opportunities, the series that World Channel and ADOC and CAM put together really helped bring the story to a larger audience. So I think that continues to be a call to action, to give opportunities for filmmakers to tell these kinds of stories, to put them in front of a broader audience. So I would say that is definitely one thing that can continue to happen and should happen.
I entirely agree with that. And, with that, we'll head towards wrapping this wonderful panel up. Each of us are such warriors in our real life. I think we have to be, as Sikh Americans, and each of us are doing such a wonderful job at continuing to kind of integrate our culture without letting it go, and bring it to mainstream media. So honestly, thank you very much for such a wonderful conversation. And Evelyn, I'll send it off to you.
Thank you, Rav, and thank you to all our speakers and for this insightful and impactful conversation. I'm still, it's just a lot, and I'm taking a lot in, and I'm learning a lot. So thank you all for that. Crossroads is available online right now on the World Channel, as well as our YouTube. and the PBS app. So be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more films and filmmakers interview. To learn more about World Channel, please visit our worldchannel.org and sign up for our newsletter. And I want to thank you all again and have a great evening.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.